St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, shaped for us, you may not know this among other things, shaped for us a way of praying that has been life-changing for me. It involves using the imagination to situate oneself in a biblical story, to feel, to taste, to smell, to listen to what's going on. It involves using the imagination to prayerfully interact with those in the story. This particular gospel reading provided for me early on in my ordained ministry a time of prayer that would prove transformational and formative. Like so many aspects of being a person of faith, it required me to put aside temporarily the rational thinking I so value. It required me to let go of having answers. It required me to ask for the grace to be open to experiencing the presence of Jesus in a new way. So I was in a group, prayerfully listening as someone read the passage we just heard. They read the passage quietly and reverently and lovingly, much like Deacon Clay just did. So I found myself initially thinking and analyzing, and I needed to reset my listening and ask God for the grace just to enter into the scene. And when I did that, I found myself in my mind's eye under a bright blue sky on a shaded dirt street lined with small, simple dwellings. See if you can imagine it with me. Immediately, I saw a woman dressed in what I had always imagined was ancient Near Eastern garb, covered from head to toe in layers of neutral-colored fabrics. She turned around and looked at me with piercing eyes and a look of simple peace. She reached out and offered her hand, which I took to walk along with her. No words were spoken between us. It was immediately clear to me that we weren't just strolling aimlessly. She led me with purpose from this shaded side street onto the main street of this little village. As we turned the corner onto the small main street, the sun was shining brightly. Can you see it? Can you feel the heat from it? The dirt road was empty, presumably, I thought, because it was midday and sensible people were inside. We walked just a bit down that main street, and she stopped. Still with no words, she directed me with her eyes to look at a particular spot on the street, and I realized that this was the woman who had touched Jesus' cloak and was healed. She had a look of such joy, a slight smile on her lips. This was the place where she was healed. She knew the exact spot, even though there was nothing around to mark or distinguish it. After a brief moment, we then turned back down this main road and soon came to a small one-room house. She walked in and I followed. After my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw several young women in the room. I realized that the tiny one-room dwelling belonged to this woman who had been healed by Jesus. This otherwise unremarkable woman, who had no resources, was sharing what little she had with other women who were in the same predicament she had been in. She had taken these women in to care for them in a society that simply didn't care about them. Now, to be clear, none of what I've described is the gospel story. You understand that, right? I'm not saying any of this actually happened. That's not the point. The point of this kind of prayer is that it opens us up to insights about ourselves and our relationship to Jesus. And in that moment, I came to see that what it means to follow Jesus is to offer whatever we have to serve his healing, forgiving, compassionate purposes, and to love others as he loves us. That's essentially our life of faith. We don't come to church or pray or worship simply to curry God's favor or to elicit God's aid. We come to see that the only life we could live that has meaning, the only life we could live that matters, is one of complete self-offering, one fully aligned with the life and ministry of Jesus. That's why I love the image of this woman. The gospel tells us she had nothing, because her illness and infirmity had cost her everything. But in my imagining, she doesn't set out to capitalize on her miracle by writing a best-selling book or starting a YouTube channel. She doesn't run away from the hardship she had endured, but rather she turns headlong into it, caring for other vulnerable women who, like her, had been cast aside, who had nowhere else to turn. I think you and I, too often, we wait for some grand sign from God to do grand things because we see ourselves as rather grand people who are worthy of nothing less. And so when that grand sign doesn't seem to appear, we use that as an excuse simply to live our lives and mind our own business. But we don't need to be extraordinary to be an instrument of God's way of love. We just need to offer ourselves. When we do, amazing things happen. I knew during that time of prayer, and I recall it every time we read this passage, that I want to be like that woman I imagined in my prayer that day. Quietly serving, loving, giving, without need for glory or attention or adulation, knowing that this kind of offering brings the peace and joy we so long to know. As I look back on our wonderful 10 years together here at Bethesda, perhaps that's the point. We don't need to obsess over being extraordinary. We don't need to be consumed by being exceptional. Perhaps what we should most celebrate today is the inexorable and steady growth in our knowledge and love of the Lord. Now, it's not that we don't have ample extraordinary accomplishments to celebrate. We do. The expansive outreach we've developed, the warm welcome to all who walk through the doors that we've cultivated, the massive capital projects we've carefully completed, the deepening and life-giving spiritual lives that so many have discovered here. We certainly must give God both the thanks and the credit for the myriad accomplishments, both extraordinary and mundane, that we have had the privilege of witnessing over these 10 years. As long as the glory and credit go to God, whose power working in us can do infinitely more than we can ask or imagine, we can be grateful to have been an instrument of God's work within and around us. I think as I look back on these 10 years, God might even excuse just a little bit of pride for what we've become, especially having been through the last 16 months or so. But let's not dwell on that bit of feeling proud. That's not where we find our true selves. Rather, we can look back and see God's hand at work. We can look back to see our shortcomings and errors, to seek forgiveness and to offer it. We can look back mostly to help us trust that God calls us forward. God isn't finished with you or me or Bethesda by any stretch. At the end of this month, in just a few days, I will no longer be your priest. I will no longer be the one to whom you turn for counsel. I will no longer be the one to celebrate those special moments in your lives and those of your loved ones, the baptisms, weddings, and funerals, among others. I will no longer be the one who brings a word of hope or challenge from the Scriptures. I will no longer be the one who places the bread in your hands. And while that fills me with sadness at this moment, it is right. It is right because you and I need to follow God's call. And as much sadness as I feel saying goodbye, I also feel peace, knowing that we have served God well together, and that I'm called to a new ministry in Southern Virginia. All too often, when a church goes through a time of transition, parishioners decide to withdraw or hold back, to wait and see how things go. I will tell you, that is the wrong approach to this coming time at Bethesda. Withdrawing will not put Bethesda on the best footing to call a fantastic new rector. And to be honest, it does a disservice to Hal, to Father Burrell, and to me, and the work we've all done together. just as it does a disservice to your vestry, associates, staff, and other leaders, because every single person here is called to faithfully lean into this transition. Your role is not to sit back and see how this all goes. Your role is not to reminisce about the good old days. You have a call here in this place to build up the body of Christ and to do even a small part to nurture this community. So as we say goodbye today, I hope each one of us can be like my imagining of the woman in our gospel reading after her transforming encounter with Jesus. I hope we can be not so much proud, maybe a little, but not so much proud, and definitely not so much minding our own business and waiting to just see what happens. No, I hope we can discern how we are called, just as I imagine she discovered her call. I hope we see that our particular life circumstances actually lead, if we are courageous and attentive enough to pay attention, lead to particular ways we are to serve God in our lives and in our community of faith. Let's absolutely feel joyous and grateful for our 10 years of ministry, of challenge, of grief, of laughter, of learning, of serving, and of giving. Let's embrace the sadness that comes today as we go our different ways. But mostly, let's remember that as God's people, we are called to live and serve and love in such a way that the world sees the light of God shining through us. In big ways and small, visible and hidden, each of us has a role to play. Each of us has a call.